Welcome to this lecture on the ethics of life, in which we have a whole bucket of topics to talk about that fall within this category, ethics of life. It are things like abortion and euthanasia and in vitro fertilization, perhaps vaccination, stem cell research, capital punishment. There's a number of things that are really tricky topics to talk about that would fall into this category. And so giving a quick overview of each of the parts of the Wesley Quadrilateral about getting some tracks on which to run on any of those topics. Starting with Scripture, when we look there, however we approach those topics that I just listed, we need to be very clear about the value and the sanctity of human life from a scriptural standpoint. And we say that because Scripture teaches that we are made in God's image, specifically by Him, to be His representatives on this earth, representatives of an eternal God who are meant to steward or to guard or to govern over His creation in some profound ways. And we're meant to shine His glory through our stewardship of His creation. So there's a real sacredness of human life on that. Or Jesus invites us to be ambassadors of reconciliation on behalf of the cross. And so to entrust the cosmic good news that the power of sin and death has been broken to people in this world means that there's a sanctity of life that is involved with that. I love how Dallas Willard describes our partnership with God as we are these sacred image bearers when he says that we're actually co-conspirators with God on behalf of His kingdom. Jesus describes us as being friends, not just servants, not just sheep, but as friends. And when Jesus, even as divine, took on flesh and dwelt among us, we see in all of those pictures that however we approach these conversations from a biblical standpoint about abortion and euthanasia and stem cell research, and again, the whole list of them, that these are not meant to be pragmatic questions, and these are not meant to be economic questions, and they're not meant to be just questions about relationships. They really are questions of the kingdom that are based in the value of human life from Scripture. From a tradition standpoint, when we look at a lot of these topics, many of them are really recent in terms of our psyche and our consciousness and public conversation, primarily because a lot of them were birthed as science and technology began to develop more and more. Or maybe a legal case like Roe versus Wade thrust abortion much more substantially into the public consciousness. But technology, of course, brought us in vitro fertilization. A global pandemic brought questions of vaccination. We've been wrestling state by state with questions of capital punishment for a number of years as well. So when we investigate the tradition, we don't necessarily have the longest of traditions with which to reference these conversations. And between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, there again is some variance there, where the Catholic Church tends to have a lot more defined writings based on some of the Vatican documents as the College of Cardinals develop policies and ideas and orthodox ways to think about them within the realm of Catholicism. And then the Pope presents that information. So you can investigate the tradition in the Catholic Church about how to think about some of these topics through Vatican documents in a much more accessible kind of way. The Protestant Church, by contrast, has a lot of different approaches to these depending on the tradition itself. So it's going to take a lot longer to research different Protestant traditions on many of these topics. And because Protestant traditions tend to not be so centralized, and maybe they don't even have documents where they've talked about these things in official statements, it's going to almost be church by church or state by state or country by country to investigate how different traditions try to handle these different really tricky topics. The human experience, I think, as we investigate these topics, we need to keep in mind that these are not abstract ideas that we're talking about. They're not obtuse. These are many of our friends and relatives are going to have been deeply impacted by many of these conversations. I think about a class that I taught a number of years ago in which a minister was in the class, or a person training to be a minister, and he cracked open one night in a very sacred way talking about in vitro fertilization and the fact that they have some lovely children that were brought into this world through the process of in vitro fertilization. But as part of that process, he and his wife also had left maybe 3 or 4 embryos in a state of suspended animation, with tens of thousands of other embryos in our country today that are waiting to be implanted and otherwise might get discarded after 20 years. And he was really wrestling with, so what do I do with these unimplanted embryos? And he talked sacredly about that topic. And so people's lives are deeply impacted by these things. This isn't just an exercise in intellectualism. This really when we scratch beneath the surface of the people to whom we minister, very often this is part of their experience. So to be a person who learns how to handle these conversations with care and compassion is as important as any kind of knowledge base about them. And of course, the science is really helpful as well to investigate when it comes to some of these different topics. Euthanasia is something that we can look at in terms of how science has the ability to extend our lives much longer than even a few generations ago, where the life expectancy of human beings in American culture and even specific subsets of American culture is now extending into 90, 95, 100 years old from a base of maybe 60 or 70, not too many generations ago. And with that comes a lot more infirmity as we get older. And so people struggling with, should I end my life? And am I a weight on our economic healthcare system? All of these questions have come up too. And so looking at the science of when should medicine intervene where it'd be helpful on behalf of the future, when is medical intervention perhaps too much, and how we think about these things is going to be helpful as well. So as we get into these tricky topics on the ethics of life, we'll want to remind ourselves of the sacredness of human life as seen in the scriptures. We'll want to look at a broad variety of traditions, understand that the people to whom we're ministering very much are impacted by these, so we need care and compassion, and that science and reason and rationality can be really helpful in teaching us more about each of these issues.